Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the kind introductions, Dominique. My name is Martin Straathof. I am the Executive Director at the Ontario Farmland Trust. And I do want to start off by saying that I'm very thankful and grateful to the County Foundation for inviting us here today to be able to talk about the critical issue of farmland loss and the work that we do at the Farmland Trust to help prevent and curb this rate of farmland loss that we're seeing in the province. I'm really going to be focusing mostly today on talking about conservation easements. And those are the tools that we use at the Farmland Trust to help permanently protect farmland. I'll touch base on a couple of other activities that we do as well and introduce you all to the mission and objectives of our organization. But first, a little bit about myself. So I grew up on a dairy farm just outside of Arnprior, which is about 60 kilometers west of Ottawa. And so let's see if I can do this all right. So here's a picture of our farm. We stay busy with it. My dad and my uncle are still farming the property, and my grandfather has retired on the property. We abut right up against Highway 417. And of course, when I was growing up, it was just Highway 17 at the time, and then it gets expanded to the 4 lanes. And what came along with that was quite a bit of development. So you'll see here, this all used to be farm field. This used to be farm field. This is a bit of a dated map from Google Earth because this is in development, and this is all in development. So we're one of the last farms along the highway when you're exiting the highway. Growing up, I was actually kind of envious of Prince Edward County because I felt growing up on a farm that our community didn't really invest that much or really absorb a part of the identity of being an agriculture and rural rooted community. And I felt like when I remember seeing a lot of advertisements about Prince Edward County and being the food and drink capital and really trying to embrace and promote its agricultural sector, I was a little bit jealous, but I think also you'll probably all be sitting here saying, well, the grass is always greener, Martin, so don't always think that it's all rainbows and butterflies all the time with the agricultural community. But I say that because when I get into talking about the work of the Farmland Trust, I think we look at a lot of issues across Ontario as being very similar in agriculture, but local and regional context plays a big factor into why some of these issues exist. And so while I felt like development was happening in Arnprior because they were trying to attract residents from Ottawa to come out and move and kind of help with the municipal tax base, we're still seeing a lot of development also taking place in Prince Edward County, but we can ask ourselves, was this a product of almost too much success in the sense that agritourism was highly promoted, and now we're seeing a lot of investment coming in from the GTA, and from that we're seeing a lot of development. So maybe a different approach, but the result still being the fact that we are losing an unsustainable amount of farmland. So who we are. The Ontario Farmland Trust, we were founded in 2004, and we were actually born out of a research project by University of Guelph researchers that saw the alarming rate of farmland loss in this province, and they ended up having a forum that brought a lot of thinkers together to say, hey, how can we help protect farmland in this province? And we looked to our neighbors to the south, and they had a lot of robust agricultural land trusts already working to preserve farmland. And so out of that came the idea of creating an Ontario Farmland Trust to help protect farmland. And apologies that the side words are taken off there. But what I think is important from that is that we were able to learn a lot from our neighbors down south and be able to kind of hit the ground running when we opened our doors in 2004. However, one of the things that did have to change was that we needed to add agricultural land as a land type in our Conservation Land Act. Because before, it did not exist in there, so we could not protect agriculture as a land use through those means. We are a charitable nonprofit. We're the only charitable nonprofit in Ontario with a provincial-wide mandate focused specifically on farmland protection. We do work with a lot of other agricultural organizations, including the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, the National Farmers Union. We also work with the Christian Farmers Federation of Ontario, Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, and the list can go on and on and on. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association as well. It takes a lot of partnerships to be able to do the work that we do. You'll see here, we're a staff of 4. That's not a lot to cover all of Ontario, but we do it. We also have 20 volunteers and our Board of Governors that oversights our operations. So our mission is to protect and preserve Ontario's farmlands and associated agriculture, natural, and cultural features. And why I emphasize that is because when we're talking about farmland, we are also talking about the natural features and the ecosystem services that our croplands rely on to be able to remain viable. So, what it is that we do. We have 3 main areas of activity at the Ontario Farmland Trust. So the first really being about the permanent protection of farmland. And there's 2 ways that we can do that. And I mentioned I'm really going to be focusing today on the farmland conservation easement agreements that we put on property title, and we'll get into more detail on that. The other way is through donations of farmland to the Ontario Farmland Trust. I heard an interesting stat just this week, actually, at an interprovincial working group on farmland preservation. And it said that 50% of farmers are going to be retiring within the next 7 years. It was a startling realization to hear that that is a reality, and hearing the stats also from Dominique earlier today, that not all of these farms also have succession plans in place. And I'll mention about how farmland conservation easements can be a tool used while you're undergoing succession planning. The second area that we do a lot of work in is public engagement and educational programming. And so really our focus there is to educate the public more on why farmland protection is so important and the critical role that farmland plays in our communities. The other area is what are the threats facing farmland and how it is that we can collectively work together to help preserve farmland in this province. The third area is policy discussion. We're seeing a lot of activity and changes in public policy right now, and we are actively engaging in submitting comments to, through the Environmental Registry Office, as well as local MPs and MPPs on the impacts that we anticipate these policies to have on farmland loss in this province. So the why. I think this is a full room of people who probably know and understand that farmland loss is unsustainable and it's concerning to the agricultural sector. So we'll dive into the numbers a little bit more. Right now, Ontario is losing 319 acres of farmland every day, and that's according to the 2021 agricultural census. That rate has nearly doubled since 2016 alone, within a 5-year time period. Over the last 20 years, we have lost over 2 million acres of farmland in this province. And if we think about the 11.8 million acres of farmland that exists today in this province, at the current rate of farmland loss, that farmland will be gone within 100 years. That is a scary thought, particularly knowing that farmland is a system in which it can't wait until the last day for the last acre to be paved over. It is at threat much sooner than that. Diving a little bit more into Prince Edward County, thank you for sharing those stats on the 7,000 acres that has been lost within a 10-year time period between 2011 and 2021. So that accounts for about 8% of the cropland in Prince Edward County. As I said, we like to look at farmland beyond just the cropland and include its associated natural features as well. And that's an important stat to consider because of the impact that the ecological services of those natural features have on the viability of the cropland. So we look at it in its entirety. And when you do that, in that same 10-year time period, Prince Edward County lost almost 20,000 acres of farmland. And if we're just looking at the last 5 years in that agricultural census from 2016 to 2021, Prince Edward County lost on average 3,000 acres of farmland every year. That is an unsustainable amount of farmland to be lost in a community that is very reliant on the agricultural sector for the thriving rural economies that need to exist in order for our communities to be successful and robust and resilient, of course. So diving more into that, protecting rural communities is a critical factor on why we talk about protecting farmland. So there's the critical mass that I'm sure we're all aware of that's needed in order to maintain a viable agricultural system. So when we're thinking about local feed supplies or veterinary services, this needs to be within a certain geographical radius that makes sense for those businesses to be able to remain viable, and that those farmers have those services to be able to rely on to operate. The other piece as well is that between food production, food processing, food distribution, these are all connected, and it really all begins with the rural landscape. So protecting Ontario's farmland is also all about protecting strong rural communities, their way of life, which, when we talk about that, it often comes back to farmers and rural landowners who are stewards of the land, who contribute to environmental sustainability and sound agricultural practices that also all feed into community resiliency. Community resiliency is something that I actually spend quite a bit of time talking about, and I feel like that conversation is picking up quite a bit nowadays as well. We're relying more heavily on food imports in this province, which is also making us more vulnerable to global shifts of food supply. So we know this through, especially with the pandemic, I think we saw a lot of concerns about what was happening on the food shelves in the grocery stores. We also know that wildfires and floods have impacted our supply of food in this province. And of course, there's growing global instability. We can just look at the war going on in Ukraine and the impacts that that has had on food prices as well. Furthermore, I often hear the counter arguments saying, that's okay, we can get our food from our neighbors down south. We get a lot from them anyways and we'll be okay. The United States is losing 2,000 acres of farmland every day. So we are becoming more heavily reliant on food producers who are also in the same boat as we are, where we're losing food production. We are vulnerable to the supply chain disruptions that we are experiencing right now. And so this notion of we'll be okay because we'll get it from somewhere else, I think is a bit of a fallacy and something that I don't think is a safe way to rely on future generations to support and acquire their food supplies. I also talked about the ecosystem services as well, and why I stress this one as well. I find it quite interesting that I had a short period of time as a municipal planner with Hudson region, and as I was working there, there's lots of communities and conversations in the planning sector and economic development and businesses saying what it is that we're going to do to become more resilient to the climate change crisis. And when we look at farmland and we talk about its ability to filter and store water and how that can help prevent floods, how farmland can be used to sequester carbon, provide habitat for wildlife, particularly species at risk, I think when these communities are trying to figure out climate change resiliency plans, they're forgetting to include the role that farmland will play in this. And then it continues to be paved over at unsustainable rates. So all of this together is why the Ontario Farmland Trust's looking at farmland to include both cropland, and the natural heritage environment. Okay, we'll get into the how. This is really the meat of this presentation and what farmland conservation easements are all about. So, farmland conservation easements provide some of the strongest levels of protection for farmland for the land being converted to non-agricultural uses. This, as I mentioned, is made possible through Ontario's Conservation Land Act. And what's happening when a conservation easement is being put onto a property is that the landowner is donating the conservation rights or the conservation interests of that land to the conservation organization, in this case, the Ontario Farmland Trust. And then we hold on to those rights in perpetuity. So these are voluntary agreements that landowners get into the agreement with the Ontario Farmland Trust in order to protect their property. meaning that we're working with landowners on an individual one-on-one basis, and that conservation easement agreements cannot be forced onto you. So as you're working through this process, if at any point in time you're starting to say, maybe this isn't for us, that's okay. You're not going down too far a rabbit hole that you can't get out of either, but we work continuously with the landowner throughout the entire process to make sure that their conservation objectives are going to be met within this agreement. They're also placed on title of the property. So why that's also very important is that this means that even when the current landowner who donated those conservation interests to the Ontario Farmland Trust, when they move on, the future landowners are bound by the agreement that is on title of the property. So that's why when we say this is something that happens and is protected in perpetuity, we really do mean that it's going to be there consistently moving forward. The other important thing to note is that conservation easements are recognized within legislation, and as well, they're upheld by the courts. So we know that these have the strength needed in order to protect this land moving forward. We get this question a lot, really, what is it that can happen to undermine the easements? And we know that these can be protected. The one thing that can undermine an easement, and it's unfortunate that I have to say this, there is one thing that can undermine an easement, and that is expropriation. So the government is still bound to be able to only expropriate for particular reasons. We have not experienced a farm being expropriated that has conservation protection on it. However, it is a reality. Other people ask about ministerial zoning orders. We see those happening more and more at unprecedented rates. And I will talk about those a little bit later on, but in a nutshell, no, a ministerial zoning order can't overturn a conservation easement agreement. So the other important thing that landowners are often asking us about is, well, it sounds like we're putting our land in trust. Does that mean we're giving up ownership? And the answer is no. You maintain ownership of your property. You maintain ownership of your business. Again, we're just there to protect the conservation interests of the property itself. So this is really important in the notion that through these agreements, we're not there to dictate what type of agricultural operation you have. If it's agriculture, if it's within normal farming practices, that type of activity is permitted to happen in a farmland conservation easement. That simple. So here I will go through what's involved. And I'm really, I have fundraising at the start because, as I mentioned before, we're a charitable nonprofit. It's incredibly important for us to make sure that we have the financial resources to see through an entire conservation easement from start to finish. The total cost of a conservation easement is somewhere between $40,000 to $60,000. That is not an expense that the landowners themselves pay for. That is our responsibility as a conservation organization to pay for those fees. The one thing that would come up likely as costs for the landowners would be when they're seeking their own legal advice on this agreement. And we always encourage that landowners are going out and seeking their own legal advice. We can talk to you and give you our understanding of everything, but you're going to want to make sure that you're getting your own input that way. The next part that I want to talk about is creating zones. And I have this picture up on the slide here to show sort of what it's like when we're creating zones on a property. And these are important because sometimes landowners want to protect different features on their property. And through conservation easement agreements, we're able, for instance, to protect a forested and natural area that has different types of restrictions on activities that can happen in the forested and natural area than, let's say, the agricultural area. So those are two of the three zones. The third zone being the farmstead area or the residential area. And so this tends to be less restrictions. So if a future landowner wants to build a secondary dwelling, or they want to put in an art studio or a woodworking shop or something of that nature that isn't necessarily agricultural related, this zone allows them to have that flexibility. One of the things that I also like to say is when we're creating the zone is that it's not necessarily a blueprint of what activity is happening today on that property. And this is a really good example here. I'll try to twist myself but still talking to the mic. This farmstead area has quite a bit of farmer field in it. Pardon me. And even though it's in the farmstead area, it can still be farmed. They have the flexibility to do that. So why did the landowner choose to create a farmstead zone bigger than the area that's currently there? Well, there's the understanding that agriculture changes. We don't know what it's going to look like a couple hundred years from now. And if these agreements are there in perpetuity, this leaves some flexibility for further adaptation of agricultural business enterprises, such as on-farm diversified uses, which we're starting to see more come to agricultural land in order for the farm business to remain viable. So this creates that level of flexibility for future landowners to adapt their operation to different needs. The next part is really about writing the agreement. So this is negotiating the content that goes into that. As I mentioned, there's 3 different zones, and we can have 3 different levels of protection for each zone. So we talk about what types of interests the agriculture landowner has in terms of protecting those interests on the property. So I have a couple of examples to share with you. Let's say in the agricultural area, which again, pretty much as normal farming practices can happen, but what might be restricted is something like commercial uses, such as preventing a golf range from being put in or a campground. Other pretty common types of clauses that go in is talking about no alteration of the topography, or no hazardous access soil dumping, no garbage dumping, no interference or alterations with lakes, ponds, or other types of waterways. Of course, what's interesting about this is that agricultural practices do alter the topography. And so, well, how can we do that if that kind of language is in there? There's the exception clauses of saying, of course, agriculture can happen, normal farming practices can happen. So when we're talking about either tilling or plowing or any type of cultivation that might change the structure of that, those are permitted. Probably the most common question I have gotten is, we want to turn this field into pasture for some livestock, some grazing livestock that we want to have a pond in. So we have to dig out that pond. That's the alteration of the topography. Can we allow that? And the answer is yes, absolutely you can allow that. Having a water source for your animals in a field is a normal agricultural practice. What ends up happening, though, is that we, as the Farmland Trust, and wanting to preserve the conservation interests, just require what your plans are 10 days in advance. Tell us what you're planning on doing. If there's any major red flags that says, well, that doesn't actually look like it's going to be a watering hole for animals, it looks like you're putting in a lake and then you're going to build a lake house or something, not that anything like that has ever happened before, just a poor example of what if. We have that conversation with the landowner, say, what would be going on here? What's the plan? What's the ultimate goal? We have not had any sorts of problems like that in the past. I think people pretty much understand that it needs to be sort of within the confines of what they're intending to use it for. So once the agreement itself is drafted and we know the zones, one of the final pieces is to have an appraisal done. And why this needs to happen is because we as the Land Trust need to understand the value of those conservation interests being donated to us. Conservation rights have a public interest, and therefore we are able to issue the landowner a tax receipt for the value of what those conservation interests are. That's done by, it can be done a couple different ways, but basically it would be, what's the fair market value of the property without a conservation easement on it? Then we'll look at what is the likely sale value of the property with these restrictions. Between the two, what is the difference of those two values? And the difference is what the value of the conservation easement is appraised at. We would issue you then a tax receipt for that value. and that tax receipt is good to be carried forward for up to 5 years. And again, another piece of advice that we often are giving landowners is to make sure that you're going out and talking to any sort of tax advisors and consultants and your accountants to make sure that you're getting the best advice possible on using these types of tax returns. One of the other notes that I'll make about this is that when an appraiser is looking at the fair market value of the property, they're looking at it as what is the highest possible valued use of this property for what it's currently designated at. So they're not going to look at, well, you know, there's a lot of speculative purchases that are going on out there, and it's possible that maybe someday a developer is going to come by and sell it for this amount of money, and the value of the property would end up being, you know, millions more than what we would see if it being sold as agricultural land. It has to be for what it's currently zoned as. The other note I'll make, typically what we see is somewhere between a 10 to 17% decrease in the value of the property in which the conservation easement was put on, and that's about the approximate tax receipt that gets then issued. So you're looking at a tax receipt somewhere between 10 to 17%. There's definitely no guarantee on our part of what that return is actually going to look like, but it just gives people an idea of what they might be able to expect. The other interesting piece that I'll say, though, is even though we have seen the value saying that it's somewhere between 10 to 17%, we've been tracking some of the recent sales of our properties that have conservation easements on them, and because the properties are often in such pristine conditions, they're actually selling for pretty much the same price that you would on a farm property that has no protections on it whatsoever. So I can't say that that's always going to be the case, but it's been interesting to see nonetheless. So I mentioned this gets registered through the Land Registry Office to be put on title. So they need a conservation easement agreement itself, a survey done with the delineated zones, and the third and final thing that we need to have done is a baseline documentation report. And this is a really critical tool for the Ontario Farmland Trust that allows us to understand what the state of the property was at the time that the easement was put in place. So why this is so important is, let's say for instance, there's an example of where there was some dumping that was done previous to the conservation easement. We'll have record of that so that when we come and do monitoring visits and we see something that looks like dumping that might have been a violation, we have record of that having existed prior, and we're not going to go to the landowner and saying, well, there's a violation here. We know that that was already there, and we're not penalizing anybody for something that had previously existed. And so that gets to my final point, which is the annual monitoring visits. Once the easement is put in place and once the tax receipt is issued, we're not done there. We are responsible for conducting annual monitoring visits, and this is when we have a qualified staff member from the Farmland Trust come, walk, do a tour of the property, just be able to see if there's any changes in any of the uses and make sure that there's no violations. One of the other interesting things that it does is it helps us to monitor if there's, for instance, any disease coming through, perhaps affecting a number of trees in the area. So if a number of trees get killed off 1 year, or the landowner takes them down, and there was a restriction on how much wood could be taken out of the forested area in any particular year, we're monitoring for those sorts of things, which also helps us give important information to the landowner. One of the species that we're often looking for are the butternut. They're a species at risk, and there's a number of butternut trees on properties that we have protected, and we're able to provide updates to the landowner on the state of that tree and its health and its conditions. The other piece that these monitoring visits allow us to do is create a record of activity that's happened on this property. And although that might not sound very exciting for somebody who's already owning the property and pretty much knows the history better than we do, 10, 20, 50 years down the line, and we have new landowners who are owning these properties, here's an organization that has a long history of recorded knowledge about different activities that took place on this property. And that's very beneficial when we're thinking about the turnover rate in which we were talking about earlier, farmers leaving the land and what's happening to all of that knowledge. Here's an opportunity for us to hold on to that knowledge for future landowners to be able to gain a little bit of a better understanding of the different activities that took place on the property. So I'm also going to mention the Ecological Gifts Program. This is important to mention because this is a federal government program that provides enhanced tax incentives for conserving land. Now, to qualify, the land has to be considered ecologically sensitive. And so while we're going through the conservation easement process, we're doing, if we want to apply for this program, we'll do ecological assessments and apply on the landowner's behalf. Again, there's no guarantee that the land will qualify. We have had a fairly decent success rate with conserved farmland to qualify. And I do have up on the slide here, so the tax credits, now they're good for a carry forward of 10 years instead of just the 5. And as well, there's no taxable capital gains, which is, of course, I think, huge benefit when we're talking about land transfer that will be happening in the next several years. So just to recap, some of the things that conservation easement agreements can help protect agricultural land from. They prevent non-agricultural development from happening. So no subdivisions are going up on farmland with a conservation easement agreement. They prevent natural resource extraction from occurring. So no aggregate operations are moving in onto our prime agricultural landscapes. They support the community's climate change mitigation strategies. They also can't be overturned by change in land use designation, either at the provincial or the municipal level. So that's what I was mentioning earlier about ministerial zoning orders. Just because they might want to change the land use designation on that property, that conservation easement agreement on the title of that property will supersede any types of changes that they're trying to do in zoning. The other piece about farmland affordability. One of the things that conservation easements do is pretty much prevent speculative buyers from coming in to say, I can buy that piece of property and maybe I can finagle my way into getting it rezoned and get some subdivisions built and I'll make millions. They can't do that if there's a conservation easement agreement on it. So we're not seeing farmlands being sold at prices that are outside of the reach of the next generation of farmers who are trying to acquire farmland, or farmers who are trying to expand their operation and can't compete with the deep pockets of developers. One of the other pieces too is this notion of farm business investment. We know through ample amount of research that when farmers start to see subdivisions creeping towards their farm, they start to feel that what's the point of continuing investing in the development of this farm operation if it's going to be paved over in the next 10, 20 years. So they start to see less investment in their farm operation. With farmland conservation easements, there is security in knowing that there are going to be other farms remain intact and operational, and that ends up spurring and exciting some more investment into the operation. So of course, this goes back to what we were talking about in terms of rural economies and some economic development that can occur there. And then the final piece is that uncertainty of farm succession. With such a great number of farm operations that aren't sure of what's going to happen next with their operation, who's going to take over, they might sell it and hope that they're selling it to somebody who is a farmer, who has every intention of farming, but who knows what's going to happen to that farmer in 5 or 10 years. There could be some life circumstances in which they can no longer maintain the property, and then they end up selling it, and who knows who it goes to after that. So this provides that level of certainty when you're thinking about farm succession, that no matter who you hand this farm off to, it's going to remain as agricultural land. So, with all that being said, I'm going to talk briefly about the impact that we have had to date. So our success at farmland protection with conservation easements, it continues to grow. So our first one was actually put on a farm property in 2009, and it has grown since then to now having 22 properties that's covering 2,500 acres. Now that's across Ontario, and these red tractors indicate whereabouts those properties are located. Those white and blue dots indicate current projects that we're working on. And for specific context with Prince Edward County, 4 property parcels are protected with our conservation easements. 3 more projects are actually currently underway in Prince Edward County. We couldn't put all the dots there because they're just kind of all overlapped, so there's a few that's going on. And we have another 6 inquiries from landowners in the region who are interested in protecting their property. So our activity in this area is increasing exponentially. Now that was just the Prince Edward County numbers of conversations we're having. We have 27 other conversations happening with landowners right now. So we're talking about in the next couple of years, jumping from our number of protected farms from 22 up to possibly 50 or more. Now, one of the things that I think has really sparked the interest of farmland owners in this is, I think, when we saw the unprecedented urban to rural migration that happened when the pandemic hit. And a lot of people were starting to move out into rural communities and development was starting to increase, and farmers were saying, oh, maybe now's the time that we need to act on this. We should start reaching out to the Farmland Trust. We're also seeing the Build More Homes Faster Act, the Dauphin Rouge Agricultural Preserve Act being repealed, as well as Highway 413, that's a proposed highway to be built across the greenbelt. All of these activities are spurring a lot of interest in farmland owners to say, what can we do to protect our property? And so they're reaching out to the Ontario Farmland Trust, asking about our farmland conservation easements. So truthfully, with those stats I said at the start of the presentation, we have not been keeping up to the rate of farmland loss. 319 acres a day being lost, and we're protecting somewhere between 300 to 500 a year. That's not keeping up in the slightest. However, we have been doing quite a bit of work to determine mechanisms that we can end up increasing and having a greater number of farms protected in a shorter period of time, and have a local focus to create clusters of farmland so that that notion of farms being protected in a particular area has that critical mass of being protected in order to protect the agricultural system. One of the other things that I just want to leave with a thought in your minds is the idea of supporting the Ontario Farmland Trust. So even if you don't think a conservation easement is right for you or your property, or maybe not right now, there's other ways that you can help the Ontario Farmland Trust achieve its mission of protecting farmland across the province. And so I did mention that we are a charitable organization, so yes, we're often looking for donations. We have about a split budget where we get our about 1/3 of our funding from private donations, about 1/3 of our funding from foundations, and 1/3 from government. We have been very lucky in Prince Edward County with several community foundations that help support the work of farmland protection here. I'm very much looking forward to continuing working with the County Foundation moving forward, but we also have great support from the Consicon Foundation, the Echo Foundation, and the Woodcock Foundation. And of course, there's many more across Ontario that help support the work that we do, but I just wanted to highlight these particular ones, given that they have been very invested in the work that we're doing here in Prince Edward County. So knowing that there is, these groups with funding that is helping support this work is a really important consideration when you're thinking about getting involved in a conservation easement. I think, yes, of course, it's a very serious issue, and we've seen some scary numbers, but I hope you also saw the momentum that we're having right now in this region for greater amounts of farmland being protected. Thank you all so much.